Welcome back. In this video, we're going to be creating a Bruteforce tool using our Python skills. So, in the previous section where we talked about web application penetration testing, we covered tools that are used for brute forcing, but this time I want to see whether we can create our own tool that will be able to brute force a login page. Now, before we even start, I want to mention that this tool will not be universal, so for every different page you will have to perform some minor modifications, the same way that we did inside of our Hydra tool and inside of our burp suite. Nonetheless, let us see how we can create it. So if I type ls and navigate to my desktop directory, here we got the tools directory for our coding projects, and here I'm going to create the web app pentest directory. So I will navigate there, and currently this directory is empty. So let's nano our Python program. We can type nano and then bruteforce.py. Great. Now, there is only one library that we're going to need to perform this project, and that library is the requests library. It will allow us to automate the process of sending the get and post requests. So let's just import it straight away. And let's start our program. So first thing that we must think about is what are the information that we need from the user of this program in order to brute force a login page. So we will need a URL link to that page, and we're going to need a username for that specific account. Then we're going to run a bunch of passwords onto that username, and if we manage to guess the correct password, great, we're going to print it to the screen. If we don't manage to find the password, we're going to print password not in list. Simple as that. So let's start with those information first. Let's create a variable called URL, and that variable is going to be the input value, which means that the user of this program can input which web page they want to brute force. Let's open double quotes and specify that to them. Let's do it like this, enter page URL. Here they can enter the page URL, and right after we do that, we can create another variable called username, and this variable will do the same thing, so it will be the same input value, just this time we're going to ask for the username. So let's just type enter username for the account to brute force. And this is pretty much it for now. Now later we are going to add some other information regarding this project, but for now we only need these two variables. So how are we going to approach this? Well, first, since we have the URL and the username, we can start with opening a file that will contain the passwords that we're going to use to brute force. So we can do that with open, and we can call that file passwords.txt, and this is also something that we can ask the user, for example, input the name of the password file to use, and that would actually be a good thing. So what I'm going to do is, this is another information that we're going to ask from the user, which is password file equals input and then enter password file to use. Simple as that. Let's not forget the single quotes, otherwise this will throw us an error. And let's close the brackets at the end. Now we can open that file by specifying password file, and we want to open it for reading. So we can specify just R between the single quotes, which means opening file for reading text. Now here we need to specify how we want to open it, so with open password file as passwords. That is how we're going to call our file object. Then we're going to enter a function, which I'm going to call cracking, and this function doesn't exist, we will have to code it, but nonetheless, this function will perform the brute forcing. This function will take two arguments. The first one is going to be the username, of course, that we specify at the beginning of the program execution, and the second argument will be the URL. Great. Now that we got this, we need to create the cracking function, and we're going to do that right here. So define cracking, and we specify username and URL as the arguments that it needs. So how are we going to do this? Well, we already mentioned that we are going to perform reading of the passwords. So for each password in this password list, we're going to try to send a request to that page with that password and the username. And if the response contains some valid argument that we have a valid username and password, we're going to print it to the screen as the correct username and password. And if we get something like login failed or something like that, we're going to move on to the next password. So how are we going to do that? Well, we already opened the file for reading that contains our passwords, and now what we can do is we can type for password in passwords, and remember passwords is our file. Then for each password inside of that passwords file, we can first strip it out of any additional characters using the strip function, so password will be equal to password.strip. This will remove any, for example, empty characters or something like that might cause us a problem in brute forcing this page. Then once we do that, we're going to print to the screen trying and then the password that we're currently trying, just so the user of the program can see which password is it currently trying to brute force. Once we do that, we need to send the request to that page. So how can we do that? Well, in this case, since we're going to brute force, as usual, our DVWA login page first, if I log out, we know that this is being sent with post form. So the method of sending the usernames and passwords is post, and we can check that once again just by finding the form, and we can see that the method is post. That's why inside of our code, we're going to type requests.post, and we're posting, and this request.post takes two arguments in our case. The first one is going to be the URL, which is logical because we need to tell our program where you want to post that data. And the data that we want to post will be equal to this. Data equals data. Just, we don't have the data yet. We need to tell our program what is our data. So how can we do that? Well, we can go right here and define data, and data has to be a dictionary. Inside of this dictionary, we have a key and the value, and we need to specify all the information that the program needs in order to perform a successful login. And that information would most likely be the username, the password, and the button that it has to click. Remember the same thing we had in Hydra tool. We need to click on this button in order to successfully submit the username and password. So how can we define it right here? Well, we define it like this: username, two dots, username. And this username is just the name of the field on our page, and this is the part of the program that you might need to change depending on the page that you're brute forcing. If the username field on the page that you're brute forcing is called something like user, then you must change this to user. And this right here is just the username that we're sending, which is the one that we ask the user of the program to input at the beginning of execution. The same thing we must do for passwords, and the reason why I'm already typing the username fields is because I already know that the name of the fields is username and password, because we already checked that in our web application penetration testing section. Okay, once we do that, we can do the same for password, and once again, we need to put the password into that password field, and the password will be this stripped value that we read from our passwords file, or from our passwords list. And the last argument that we need to specify is going to be the button. As you remember, once we send it right here, the button name is login and the type of button is submit. So we must specify it like that. Just this time, both of these values are going to be between the single quotes because none of them is an actual variable. So this is going to be our data. And in this requests.post, we're sending that data to our URL. And luckily our request library will perform everything else for us, so it will know where to put this data that we're sending. Of course, instead of just sending this data, we also want to store the response somewhere. So we can create a response variable, and that response variable will be equal to whatever the return value is from this requests.post function. And the return value is going to be the HTML page of the response. once we receive the response, we have to check whether the password was correct or not. So how can we do that? Well, we can do that the same way that we did inside of our Hydra. Remember that in Hydra we had to specify the string that occurs once we specify the incorrect username and password, which is this down here, as we can see login failed. Well, we can do something similar inside of our program. Let's ask the user of the program first. We can create a variable, login failed string, and we can ask the user enter string that occurs when login fails. Simple as that. And once they enter the string, hopefully they enter something like failed or login failed. They don't have to enter the entire thing, they can just enter failed, which occurs on this page once you specify incorrect username and password. Then what we can do is we can check whether we find that string inside of our response. Now, to do that, we must type the if statement. And if statement will be something like this. If login underscore failed underscore string in response.content.decode, then we have the incorrect password. And the reason why we're decoding this is because otherwise it won't be able to find this value inside of our content. So we must decode it first, and then it is basically searching for this string inside of the HTML page of the response. If it finds that string, that means we found the incorrect password, because that occurs only when it is incorrect. That's why we're just going to pass. We're not going to do anything. And if it doesn't find, which would be the else statement, then what we can do is we can print found username and we can plus the username, and we can print the same thing for the password. So found password and plus password. So this will print the current username, which is always the same, and it will print the current password, which is currently in this iteration of this loop, which will be the correct password because it didn't find this string inside of it. After we find it, we can just exit the program. There is no need to continue brute forcing, so we can just exit out of the program. Okay, now that we did this, let us see whether this works. So if I go down here, and once we finish the cracking of the function, we can also print at the end, in case it doesn't find anything, password not in list. So we can just do it like this. Once it finishes the cracking function, it will go to this statement and it will print password not in list. If it finds the password, it will go to this statement right here and it will exit out of the program, so this will never get printed. Let's give it a try to see whether this works. So if I Ctrl O to save, and the first thing that I want to do is I want to copy the passwords.txt file that I got on my desktop to the home Mr. Hacker desktop, tools, and then web app penetration testing. And if I ls, here we're going to have our passwords.txt file. And since this seems to be an incorrect passwords.txt file, I'm just going to delete this and I'm going to create a new one. Not really sure where is the last one, but let's just create it real fast. So the passwords can be something like test 123, 123, 4, 5, 6, 7, password 123, admin, root, and then the correct password. So we're just going to write password right here. And let's also write the password for the Gordon account, just so we can test two different accounts. And let's write another incorrect password at the end, which could be ABC. Okay, this is just the test example of the program, and let's Ctrl O and let's Python 3 our bruteforcer.py. So the first argument that it asks is the page URL. So what we can do is we can visit that page, copy the link to that page, and paste it right here. http://192.168.1.2/dvwa and then /login.php. Click enter. It asks for the username for the account to Bruteforce. We're going to use admin. The password file to use is passwords.txt. And make sure if the password file that you want to use is outside of the directory of your program, you will need to specify the entire path to that file. Once we do that, let's click enter, and it asks us for the string that occurs when login fails, and we can just type login failed, because that is what occurs on our page right here. For different pages, this will be different. Press enter, and it found the correct username and correct password. And it did it really fast. It tried these 7 passwords, none of those worked, then it ran onto the password and it printed out found username and found password. Let's also try for the Gordon just to make sure everything works. So I'm going to paste the link, or just type it in. The username is this time going to be Gordon B. The passwords file is going to be passwords.txt, and the string is going to be once again login failed. Press enter, and it also finds the username and the password for that account as well. Great, our program works. But let's also see how would we be able to brute force the inner page of this DVWA program or application. We also got this brute force page right here. But this is something that we'll have to brute force differently. Why? Well, first, it requires different type of request. It requires the GET request. And the second thing is this can only be brute forced within a current session. So if we are not logged into this page, we cannot even access this brute force page, and therefore we cannot really brute force. So we must also see how we can send this session inside of our program so we can be able to brute force this username and password. Let's give it a try. If I go to our program and nano the bruteforce.py, first thing that we must specify, as I already said, we're going to need to specify the session. So we need to ask for the user for the cookie value of that session. And they can just read it from the burp suite, just like we did once we covered our Hydra tool. So we can specify right here, enter cookie value. And this can be optional because we don't need it always, just like we didn't need it currently. But if they're brute forcing something within a session, then they must specify this as well. Now, what we can do is inside of our cracking function, right above the if statement, we can write another if statement. So if cookie value is not equal to an empty string, and if it is equal to an empty string, that means that the user doesn't require the cookie value. And in that case, it will not send the cookie value and it will just brute force without the session. If it is set to something, then we're going to send the cookie value inside of our request. So in this case, if response, if cookie value is not empty, that means we must send it. So the response will be equal to requests.get, and this time we're using get because inside of this page our form is using the method get. That's why this time we're using the requests.get. This is something that you want to change depending on the page that you're brute forcing. So requests.get, and the first parameter is going to be the URL. The second parameter, we're going to set our parameters, which we specify like params. And those params are going to be equal to, once again, a dictionary. And that dictionary will be rather the same like this. Just a few minor changes we're going to set. So copy this and we're just going to paste it right here. The first change is under the button. So the username and password field are named the same, like in our last page, as we can see right here. Inside of the form, the name for the username is just username, and the name for the password is password. But the login is not the same. We got the value for login to be login, and the name for login to also be login. So we can set it like this. Login, and then 2 dots, and once again, login. And the last parameter to this function, or the last argument to this function, is going to be cookies that are equal to a dictionary of cookie value, 2 dots, and then cookie value variable. And you can read the name of that field by going to your burp suite, and once I, for example, specify test and test123 as our username and password here, and then I go and find that request inside of our burp suite. Let's find it real quick, and I believe it is this one right here. Yeah, here it is. We can see that the cookie field is named just cookie. That's why we specified right here as cookie between the single quotes, and we spaced the cookie value to that field. Once we do all of that, we have all of our parameters to this function, and this seems to not be able to fit inside of my screen, but it doesn't matter, it is there. And all we're left to do right now is create the else statement as well. And the else statement is going to be else. In this case, we don't have the cookie value, so we can just copy this part of code and paste it right here. And now we can delete it from here because we no longer need it. So this program is pretty much only used to brute force the main login page to the DVWA and this brute force page inside of the DVWA. You will need to adjust a few things right here once trying to brute force a different page, such as, for example, the name of the fields, the name of the cookie, and you will also have to adjust whether it is a GET request or a POST request. Everything else, I believe, can stay the same. Now that we got our code ready, let us see whether this works. So if I save this and I go and try to run this, let's first of all try once again to brute force the main login page by typing dvwa/login.php. The username is going to be admin, the passwords file is going to be passwords.txt, and the string that occurs is going to be login failed. Cookie is going to be optional, so I'm just going to press enter because I don't need it for the main login page, and it will still manage to find it. But let's see whether it will manage to find the correct username and password if I use the cookie value and if I brute force inside of this session. Let's give it a try. I will enter the page URL, and the page URL is going to be the URL to this page right here, which is this one. So let's copy it, paste it right here, press enter. The username is going to be the same, so it is going to be admin. The passwords file is going to be the same. The string that occurs is not going to be the same, so let's give it a try and see what happens once we send hello as username and hello as password. We get username and or password incorrect. Now, we don't need to specify this entire statement. We can just specify incorrect. And if it just finds the incorrect, that means we specified the incorrect password. Therefore, it is going to go on to the next one. So let's press enter. And the cookie value is something that we can read from our burp suite. So let's find the request that we used to send hello and hello as username and password. And here it is. All we need to do from here is find the cookie field and copy the cookie value. So security equals high and the PHP session ID is set to a random value. All we need to do is paste that right here and press enter. This will start the brute forcing of our page, and you will notice that this time it goes a little bit slower because we're brute forcing inside of a session. Let's see whether it will manage to find once it gets to the correct username and correct password. Let's give it a few seconds. And here it is. It worked successfully. We found the correct username, which is admin, and the correct password, which is password, and now we can use that to log in to this page. As it says, welcome to the password protected area admin. So we successfully coded a Bruteforcer. Now you can perform some minor changes to make it even better, such as, for example, importing from term color, import the function colored, and this will allow us to print everything in a different color. For example, let's go down here And this first print statement we can print like this, colored. And at the end we specify inside of the, for example, let's print this in red. We close 2 brackets. And once we also find the correct username and password, we can print this in green. So print colored. At the end, we add comma and then green. And we close 2 brackets. Same thing we can do right here. And let's not forget the colored function right here. So colored. And now if we run this, python3 bruteforcer.py, let's use the regular main page, which is dvwa/login.php. Admin is the account, passwords.txt is the file, and failed is going to be the string that occurs. And it is even better, right now it prints the incorrect passwords in red color, and once it finds the correct username and correct password, it prints it in green. Great. We coded our project, everything works perfectly, just don't forget to change certain values inside of our program once you try this on a different web page. The 2 main things that you need to keep an eye on is the name of the fields inside of our source code. So you just find the form and you see how the fields are named. Then you use that inside of your dictionary, and the next thing that you need to pay attention to is the method that is used to send these usernames and passwords, whether it is a get method or post method. And at last, you also need to check the name of the button. So this can basically be named anything. That's why you always need to view page source and check it out before running your program. Great. Thank you for watching this coding project. We're getting better and better in Python, and in the next lecture, we're going to create another small project in Python that will be used to brute force directory names inside of a web page. This will be a smaller program than this one, but nonetheless, it will still be a useful program that you will use in your penetration tests. See you in the next video.